You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
You know, Thomas Crockett, thanks for joining me today for this really important conversation because, well, first, how are things on your end? Hope you're doing well.
Doing great. Yeah. Glad to be here.
Good. Well, you know, one of the things that we're focused on today is this discussion around the supply chain and the rates that our members in the industry at large have been paying for a number of years now. Those have started to come down from highs, from numbers that were astronomical. And as we've been focused on the supply chain and what's happening in the marketplace and what, you know, kind of the go-between shippers and carriers, there's been a lot of kind of hand-wringing and concern clearly about what the prices were at the height of COVID and the height of the spike of inventory that was flooding into the marketplace. But now that we're catching our breath, I think, and rates are coming down and inventory is starting to slow because demand has actually started to slow. It's a good time for us to reassess and think more about, okay, now that we're out of kind of the heat of the moment, how do we think more longer term about our relationships with the carriers as an industry, as shippers? And what does that look like? How do we be more strategic and collaborative? And so we have two really smart people who are going to help us navigate this issue and have hopefully a robust conversation about strategic planning in this space. And first and foremost is my good friend, Mary McNelly, who's the Vice President of Global Distribution and Logistics at two of the hottest brands on planet Earth. That's Crocs and Hey Dude. And joining Mary is Gordon Downes. And Gordon is the co-founder and CEO of NYSHEX. And Gordon will have to explain exactly what NYSHEX is. We all know what Crocs and Hey Dude are, but he'll have to explain what NYSHEX is. But first and foremost, Mary, welcome. And Gordon, welcome to Shoe In Show.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, likewise.
So, Mary, let's start with you. You're such a thought leader in the space of supply chain and logistics. You're active on LinkedIn. You speak at TPM, and you're managing the movement of two of the hottest brands in the world, if you will. And so you have a lot at stake in this conversation. But you and I have had conversations over the years about supply chain management, and I know that our industry has faced such a crazy past few years. So from where you sit now here in 2022, 2023, as we're heading into the new year, what is your kind of current strategy and thinking around managing the supply chain in a holistic way?
Yeah, for two of the hottest brands that are getting hotter, Matt.
Right.
I think, you and I started talking back when tariffs were rolling out, the China tariffs were rolling out, and carriers really hadn't yet kind of learned how to adapt to really fast market shifts. But they grew muscles through the tariffs, and we saw them really start to flex them and how to control and react to market changes. And I think actually we're going to see another phase, if you will, kind of the tariffs, before tariffs, reacting to the tariffs and learning how to manage volume and capacity and pricing control for themselves and their operations, to getting through COVID and seeing that they can take advantage of what is a capitalistic commodity, essentially. But now we're going to find new normal. And so we're going into kind of, I'm going to call it a new chapter of what ocean freight is. And I believe that we'll start to see more differentiation in the market, both in pricing, in contracts, and in service. Because carriers are learning how to control themselves. And now it's kind of up to us as the shippers to start to have a unified voice about what we want out of that market and how we want carriers to show up. I think the worst thing we can do is say, let's go back to before COVID because it was hard and we're tired and we just want what normal is to go back to what it was before COVID. Because that's actually, it's regressing, and it's not taking ourselves as shippers or the carriers or the NVOs to some of the best places that we can go in our future days as a global supply chain.
Can you tell us too, it seems like things are very, very different now than they were a year ago. And you talked a little bit about it, and I know Matt did too, but what are some of the drivers of that? Why is the situation so much different now than it was even a year ago?
I mean, it's crazy to think about. A year ago, we were rushing to get on the market, and I had quotes for $28,000 for one F to get into the US, right? And now we're looking at less than 2,000 quotes coming through to get into the US, and literally the same trade lanes. In some cases, literally the same partners that are offering to move at those rates. So it's a totally different world. I preached about a year ago saying we need to think of ourselves as shippers, as being shippers of choice. How do we be attractive to shippers? Because carriers had the upper hand in the reality of limited capacity. I think what's important is that still need to be shippers of choice. We still need to be customers of choice to our partners. We just need to know what our strategy is. And some of us shippers are going to go out and cost is the number one thing we want to get after, right? So this is a moment to try to chase cost very short term. It's my belief that that's a short-sighted behavior to do in this moment. But I also think you can still ask to be a partner of choice compared to a year ago. But I think the biggest unknown of shaking the crystal ball is all about what are rates going to be as we go into RFP next year, and what does kind of normalized behavior start to look like, so we can all get off of this crazy roller coaster that we've been on for the last few months.
Now, Gordon, let's pivot over to you, and let's first and foremost help our listeners understand what NYSHEX is and kind of how you operate in the marketplace and where you fit in to Mary's point about developing more collaboration between the shippers and the carriers and this new normal, as she spoke of.
Sure. Well, so very quickly to explain what we do, we're a technology platform. We like to say we're providing digital infrastructure for the global container shipping industry. And what we mean by that is the contracting process in container shipping is extremely complicated. There is a lot of nuance in the contract itself, and there's a lot of different types of contracts, and that's becoming more prolific. And it's extremely complicated keeping track of all the individual bookings and container movements and reconciling that back to what was agreed to and where there might be a gap, what caused that gap, where did the breakdown take place, etc. So our technology does that. And we like to say our technology provides essentially three things. Number one is a shared system of record that both the carrier and the shipper can contribute data to, and it creates this trusted sort of framework for the relationship based on data. The second one is workflows, and thereby improving the way in which carriers and shippers collaborate and reducing a lot of the email back and forth and all those sort of rather inefficient tasks. And then the third one is just fully integrating into our members' systems so that it can just plug into their existing workflows. And so that's essentially what we do. But the underlying sort of vision that we have is we believe that carriers, shippers, and of course NVOCCs as well can be more effective if they work together on a shared system of record, shared incentives, etc., and ultimately reduce a lot of the waste and frustration that our industry currently experiences. And I think Mary alluded to that. Just very quickly touching on the sort of the way forward, I completely agree with everything that Mary said. I think that there's just two things most people probably don't realize, and that is, number one, container shipping industry is incredibly volatile. Like the price of container shipping pre-pandemic, of course, post-pandemic was even more volatile. It's twice as volatile as the oil price, 3 times as volatile as the corn price, and I think it's 5 times as volatile as the S&P 500. So it's just an extremely volatile market, and that's largely because the carrier network structure is perishable, and these carriers are running these big ships, and when there is a vessel which is going to be potentially sailing light that is fully booked, but the cargo doesn't show up for that vessel, the value of that slot on the ship completely perishes. And that drives a lot of very short-term based pricing decisions. When there's a shortage of cargo, everyone's scrambling to load that cargo. It pushes rates rapidly down. But by the same token, when there is not enough capacity, we also learned that demand is fairly sort of inelastic, and the prices can go up extremely high. And so that's what drives this sort of insane volatility. Now, the way to, I think, solve the problem that both carriers, shippers, and of course NVOs as well can play a role in is just being more deliberate about what the expected demand is in the cargo flows. Because if a carrier knows ahead of time what cargo to expect on a given vessel, they can shuffle their network and make sure the vessel does what they would call an inducement call and potentially tops up with additional cargo. Or if there's just not enough cargo to justify that vessel, they can blank the sailing, and they can do a lot of things to make their network and essentially their customer supply chains more efficient, more resilient. But if they don't know until the last minute, that's the real killer. So what we're seeing, just building on what Mary was saying, is that carriers are starting to innovate around the contract products that they have. And I think this is positive because it gives companies like Crocs and other importers and exporters, etc., more choice to be able to manage the supply chain. And I think this puts the burden on the decision makers, the logistics sort of heads, etc., to really build a portfolio-like strategy and to think about when to use contracts where there might be, commitments on both sides, when to use contracts where there aren't, how to blend these things together to make sure that you've got the flexibility where you need it, but the resilience where you need it. And so it's exciting. I think that the industry is going to come out of this stronger than it was before. I think that the supply chains will become more resilient, but it requires change in how we work.
Can I just
Mary,
add to that, Matt, too?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think one piece off of what Gordon said is really important that I want the BCOs or the footwear brands, especially the executives that do listen to this, to hear is that logistics and transportation is not just a procurement exercise anymore. And you would think we learned that through through living through COVID, but we didn't. I'm seeing a lot of peers get pressure from internal executive team, finance team to chase the headlines of the spot market in the newspaper instead of thinking strategically and long term about those partnerships and how we want volume to show up and what we want out of service. It's all about dollars, which, we spent a lot of money in the last 12 months. But we can't think about logistics as just a procurement exercise like it was before COVID for many brands. It is truly a strategic lever for brands to use in their supply chain and will be for the years to come.
Mary, any thoughts too on smaller brands? I know we have members that are, big global companies all the way down to family-owned businesses. How do they deal with this volatility and these changes? And any tips for a brand that might be a smaller company?
Yeah, so I think for smaller companies, definitely partnering with NVOs and understanding what the NVOs are doing for their strategy. It's not just put your business out to the NVOs and expect them to be able to fix all the problems for you. I think you really do have to slow down to learn a little bit about the industry and what's happening with it to understand how to be thoughtful. I also think maybe for the smaller brands, not everything they're ordering has the same level of priority. So starting to think about what might be really important and has speed to market need versus what could be slow moving, it is going to be another lever play. And then just understanding the supply chain of where their volume is moving. Again, even if they're small, you kind of can't get away with, I'm just going to pay somebody and they're going to do it anymore. I think you have to continue to be aware of what's happening. Small brands or big brands, just because kind of the world is acting like COVID is over and disruption is gone doesn't mean disruption's gone. In fact, right, we still see risk of labor strikes on the West Coast. We still see labor negotiations at warehouses, ports, and terminals. We still have infrastructure challenges with volume that's still up before COVID volume or from COVID volume. Disruption's here to stay, and even the small guys need to kind of take a breath. Let's all pause from what we just lived through, but don't get complacent. Continue to think forward about how you can adapt to a supply chain and market that's going to continue to evolve. I think for the small guys, it's going to be really important to have conversations with partners, to listen and learn, to say, here's what I want to do. How do I get there? And lean on the size of their NVO partners. And if they're big enough for a little bit of direct volume, the direct partners to create a strategy together.
Now, Gordon, I want to kind of unpack further this point Mary made about the atmosphere within an organization, a company. I suspect prior to COVID, there was still a lot of focus on supply chain. It probably reared its ugly head in spring of 15 when there was the labor stoppage at the West Coast ports, and everyone from NPR to the local news station was covering the supply chain. That dies down. I assume that kind of dies down internally within our company, member companies. and then COVID hits, and we're back with this hyper focus on the supply chain that doesn't seem, based on what Mary said, doesn't seem to be going away because of the highs of the costs that we saw. And then these numbers, when we put out the average rates that are out there, they're much lower. And so that's going to be clearly headline grabbing and get the CFO kind of thinking more about profit than maybe long term. So from your perspective as an outsider, as a solutions provider and someone who works probably, I assume, not just with just looking at LinkedIn profiles, not just footwear, but across a variety of different product categories, kind of what's the selling point for how you all can come in and help the companies think more about long-term strategies so that folks like Mary and others who are at the helm of their supply chains are more empowered and equipped to have those internal conversations that can be just as challenging and complex as the conversations with the carriers, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. So walk us through how you are part of that process.
Sure. So you're just drawing on two things I said. One is this market's becoming more volatile and it's complex to manage all the volatility. And two, I think decision makers in the space need to think about their portfolio and building a contracting portfolio, if you like, that meets all the needs of the supply chain. And I think that's where our technology is potentially beneficial. The first one is that the way that our technology works, it allows the participants, the carriers, the shippers, the NVOCCs, et cetera, to structure contracts that might sort of meet the needs of their supply chain portfolio, if you want to call it that. And second of all, it allows them the tooling and the mechanisms to not only improve the workflows, in other words, make sure that when you have a booking on a specific carrier and that booking gets rejected or that vessel slides, a workflow gets triggered and action can be taken to get that back on track. And those workflows are very valuable, not just in terms of reducing workload, but also in terms of creating more supply chain resilience. And there's a future chapter which we're working on at the moment, which is really, given that there's all this data and there's, of course, a great deal of insight in this data, how can you use that to optimize the portfolio and the execution of the supply chain and the landed cost and everything else. But to do that, of course, in a way which is not the same as how the industry used to work. Again, just touching a little bit on what Mary had said. In the old days, there wasn't, when I say old days, I mean pre-pandemic, I suppose, there wasn't much focus on being a shipper of choice. I think a lot of the mindset was just focused on how do I just beat down my providers to get to the lowest possible cost. And of course, now with the lessons we've learned from the pandemic, and of course we've learned them in other sort of briefer moments, that's a terrible strategy. It may give you short-term cost advantage, but it puts your whole supply chain at risk. And of course, when your supply chain is at risk, your entire business is at risk. And so therefore, I think the having this more sophisticated technology and the ability to drive that portfolio strategy, to use technology and data to course correct exceptions in the supply chain, and then ultimately use that data to drive insights and optimization, I think that's a really powerful opportunity. And it's great to see folks like Mary and others who are really innovative in the space, like charting forward a new path, because it's clearly needed, and it's a wonderful opportunity for the decision makers in the space to sort of set these strategies and build resilience, but at the same time keep landed cost under control, etc.
It seems like too over the past year with during the pandemic, at least as well, we saw different places of the world adapting differently and having different challenges and different ways of doing things. And so you would see, a situation pop up in China that was totally different from how it was being handled in the U.S. And so just thinking through the global situation with shipping all over the world and being a global company, how do you adapt to those challenges with shipping that when you have different issues in different parts of the world? And Mary, let me turn to you for that one.
Yeah, I think we are a global brand. We do have team members in our main origins to be able to manage through some of that locally. I'm actually sitting in Vietnam right now, being able to be with the team in Asia for the first time since COVID. And it's the team that's been on the front line of working with the truckers, working with each of our carriers, working with each of our regional partners who need priority product and have lived through the lockdown, right? So it's really important that the relationships exist at origin for some of the bigger brands. I think that's where, to your earlier question with smaller brands, that's why you use an NVO, because they have those relationships and are able to navigate through some of those troubled waters. But part of why I'm here is not just the team; it's also to look my local region heads in the eyes for each of our carriers and say, we are in partnership with you, right? We are going to continue to move volume with you. Our volume isn't going away. Our contracts aren't going away. We want to continue to work with you despite the change in the market. We're in this for the long haul. And that goes a long way too. So it kind of all comes back to relationships. I think there's a ton of technology, and I think NYSHEX is a fantastic example of that. But partnerships, relationships, it is still a human-driven industry and a partnership-driven industry. NYSHEX is an amazing platform that's going to be able to take us there, but it's also going to have to take partnerships and true kind of strategy that's going to get us to what can be a better world for the carriers and for us in a really fragmented supply chain. But you're right. China handled lockdown differently than Vietnam, differently than Bangladesh, than Indonesia, and we certainly had to adapt to, okay, this port tomorrow is locked down. How are we going to figure out trucking? If we didn't have a good partnership with our truckers to be able to truck from Xiamen down to Shanghai so I could still get cargo loaded, if I didn't have good partnerships with my ocean freight providers to get extra space on a vessel that could have been sold out, those partnerships are the levers that we ended up pulling on top of investing in a strong team that adapted to being creative every single week of kind of how we lived through the last few years. And I believe those things are going to come up again in the next few years. And now that team is strong to be able to manage through it. It's just day to day at this point. It's not, innovative.
Wow, that's a great way to end, Mary, because at the end of the day, the theme has been volatility, and and volatility means there's a lot of variables you can't control. But what you can control are your relationships, are the friendships and the foundations and the partners that you build. And this industry, more than others, is a familial industry. It is built on relationships. It's actually relatively small. And so I think that's a kind of great way to end the conversation, because I think the one thing we can't control is building strong partnerships. And so, Mary, thank you for coming on and sharing your insights from Vietnam, from Ho Chi Minh, from Saigon, one of the world's greatest cities. And I appreciate you taking the time. Gordon, for folks who want to connect with you, what's a good website for folks to hit up and listeners to connect with you as it relates to NYSHEX and what you all have to offer?
Sure. I think our website's a great way to get in touch. Website's NYSHEX, NYSHEX.com. And happy to provide any additional color on any of the things I've said.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Gordon. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Likewise.
Thanks for having us.
Folks, this has been another edition of Shoe and Show. We're so grateful that you've listened. It's been 6.5 years as we cranked out episode after episode, and we're just getting started in many regards. As you heard today's conversation, it's a conversation about being agile and moving through a variety of different variables that are super challenging, but with strong partnerships, as Mary talked about, we can definitely get through them. So partner with us, listen to Shoe and Show, share these episodes, come back to shoeandshow.com, subscribe, listen, rate us. Until our next episode, Shoe and Show is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.